Welcome to the second day of our conference on science and personal action, human and divine. I'm going to begin today with an overview of the issue, which ties in quite closely to how this project is developing. So the official title of the talk is Scientific Perspectives on Four Types of Special Divine Action. But this is part of a bigger project. So it's a 3-year project run by the Ian Ramsey Centre at Oxford University, in collaboration with the Philosophy Faculty of Western Michigan University and with the assistance of the Texas Center for Applied Technology. As I mentioned again yesterday, and there's some people here today who are new, we're very grateful to Professor Ian Hutchinson and Conference Services at MIT for making this conference possible. We also express our gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation for the grant that supports this project. Just before I launch into the main body of the talk, just describe what's going to happen today, and also a bit of daily news. So after this lecture, which will be the best part of an hour, we'll have a coffee break, and then we'll have short paper sessions. So many of those here will be giving short papers, and we have 2 rooms for this. So there's a room where we were yesterday, that's room 2, and then there's room 1, which is immediately next door to the right, and that's got a red color, and the room where we were yesterday is a yellow color on the outside. So those are the two breakout rooms. This room will be base camp for the day. So if you get lost, come back here or talk to MIT Conference Services outside. At the end of the day, we're going to have a panel discussion. So we're going to divide the hour and a half into 2 parts. Professor Hans Halvorsen will give a lecture for about 40-45 minutes. And then we're going to have some questions, but we're going to invite some of the speakers up to the front, and it'll be a chance to just air questions, grievances, whatever, that have developed over the course of the day or 2. And over lunchtime, if you have a question you'd like to ask to get us started, then please jot it down. You might want to jot it down on if you find a piece of paper, MIT Conference Services will give you a piece of paper, write it down, and I'm going to ask Joel to handle those. So is Joel here at the moment? Okay. Yeah, Joel, thank you. If you don't mind, would you mind collecting those at lunch? Or if after lunch, just give the questions to Joel, and we'll then select some for an exciting debate. Just a bit of overnight news. I got an email last night that one of our colleagues who spoke at our first Special Divine Action conference last summer has just won a €250,000 grant from the Dutch Scientific Research Foundation with the title Occasionalism and the Secularization of Early Modern Science, Understanding the Dismissal of Divine Action During the Scientific Revolution. So he wrote to me last night saying, can we link up and get a bit of symbiosis for this project? So I said, yes, please. And the other bit of news, I've just been invited to go back to CERN. Some of you may know I used to work at CERN about 20 years ago as a particle physicist. And about 3 years ago, took part in the 3-day conference with the Director General of CERN, because after they discovered the so-called God particle, they wanted to talk to philosophers and theologians. Thought they'd get a bit of briefing on these issues. And we had 3 very interesting days, mainly on philosophy and questions like what is truth. But anyway, they've obviously want a bit more, so we're going back there in October. Just thought I'd let you know that. Okay, so just a bit of background for the ideas behind this project. You might be wondering why the title was chosen, Special Divine Action. And well, during the pre-project planning meeting at Oxford in March 2012, Special Divine Action was compared to a trouser word, defined in reference to the other leg of the trouser. Now, the term special helps to get the project started because it helps to demarcate the field. So divine action, the sort of thing we're interested in, the difficult thing we're interested in, is what distinguishes it from deist-type approaches. But of course, getting a positive description of SDA is always more challenging. Now, the focus of most philosophical inquiry, since the 18th century at least, has been on miracles. That's where the debate's taken place. But theologically, SDA is generally considered to be much broader. And there are lots of other things which are not called miracles, but are often treated as more significant by believers. So in this talk, I want to look over this range, especially from the perspective of the knowledge, habits, or metaphors from scientific practice. So basically, those of you who were here yesterday will recall we had that introductory video. There were 4 types mentioned briefly: miracles, providence, grace, inspiration. So that's what we're going to have a look at. And by the way, this talk is also serving as a sort of working document for preparing 4 short videos, one of which has been completed, and we're working on the other 3. So the feedback you give me will help to shape these productions. So miracles. We didn't actually get a definition yesterday, so here's a working definition. It comes from Latin, miraculum, meaning object of wonder, implying a contrast with a background, an event that is remarkable and different from what is experienced ordinarily. But wonder alone, of course, is not enough to specify a miracle, and they knew this well back in the Middle Ages. St. Thomas Aquinas observes, an astronomer is not astonished when he sees an eclipse of the sun, since the astronomer knows the cause. So what else is needed to specify a miracle? Well, Aquinas gives a definition. It's very hard, but putting it into practice is harder work. So he describes a miracle as exceeding the productive power of nature. And he says a proper miracle has a cause that is unknowable even in principle, not by anyone, because the divine essence is unknowable even in principle in this state of life. So exceeding the productive power of nature. And by this approach, grades of purporting miracles are specified by the mode of excess. From something that nature could never do, like the report in Joshua of the sun and moon stopping their apparent motion in the sky, to something that nature usually does, but doesn't in the case in question, Jesus curing the fever of Peter's mother-in-law. Some purported miracles exceed the powers of nature so dramatically that they would seem to practically compel belief, but human judgment is properly cautious and retrospective. But properly cautious and retrospective judgment is more common, and it's never completely exhausted. So I chose these 2 pictures by Caravaggio, show both as reactions. So this is Supper at Emmaus, and you can see there's a moment of realizing who they're talking to, and you can almost see them go, wah! And then slightly unusual rendering of Doubting Thomas by Caravaggio, because as you may recall from the end of John's Gospel, Thomas sets the test. He's not going to believe the resurrection or that it's the real Jesus. There's different interpretations of this, unless he can actually put his finger in the side. Scripture never said he did that, but Caravaggio portrays him as actually doing this. So scientific perspectives 1, what about breaking the laws of nature? This is how the whole thing has been contextualized for the last few centuries. So the definition I've just given is not the one made famous by David Hume in Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, a violation of the laws of nature. That's a starting point of many other inquiries, and one that carries considerable metaphoric baggage. I've only gradually begun to realize what a brilliant work of genius this definition is, if you want to really muck things up. So you see, if God does interact, according to this definition, he's a lawbreaker. That's the first thing you get. And the second metaphoric connotation is that if you associate science with laws, then God is anti-science. You've got all this stuff that's in the background just by the metaphoric power of the way it's been expressed. Now, while both approaches, the Thomistic definition or the Humean definition, take a via negativa, the Humean definition has several problems, which we can show today, that hinder its ability to satisfy the criterion of an improved definition. By the way, I often ask students in schools, what makes a good definition? And a definition should define, and definitions require clarity. And by the way, the background of this and a lot more detail comes from Professor Timothy McGrew's article on miracles for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a very nice piece of work, and really gave the background of this section. So, for example, it's not always easy to identify what laws are being violated in specific reported cases. Moreover, there are many disagreements today about the meaning and efficacy of natural laws. Now, as Professor Hutchinson pointed out yesterday, these critiques do not mean, of course, there's not a strong a posteriori sense of law-likeness in nature. And this is seen most clearly in the precise quantitative behavior of aggregates of two-body systems under idealized conditions, which is the main focus of physics. I mean, I was very excited at the beginning of this week, the idea we could thread a spacecraft through the Plutonian system. But what made that possible is analyzing the system numerically using computers and really analyzing it, modeling it as an aggregate of two-body systems. We'll come back to this point later. Nevertheless, what is acceptably natural vastly exceeds the scope of law-like behavior. So the carbon atom at the tip of a horn of a galloping rhinoceros is not behaving like a free carbon atom in space, but rather as an atom integrated into a rhinoceros. So we tend to forget this. The idealized laws we have in physics are to do with perfect situations. You exclude all the rest of the universe. You have one object in space, whatever that is, and it just keeps going, right? Like the spacecraft to Pluto. But most atoms don't do that. So if imagine in your own mind's eye the atom on the tip of a horn of a galloping rhinoceros. It's not behaving like free atoms do. And of course, the law-like behavior of a falling apple cannot be used to exclude definitively the possibility of an apple being intercepted by personal action, human or divine. Okay, so not absolutely ruled out, but scientific judgments in practice tend to be guided by heuristics. The underlying causes of the cosmos are in a vague sense simple. Second, and perhaps more mysteriously, the causes are understandable. These heuristics raise philosophical questions with theological overtones, very interesting theological overtones. In the case of miracles, however, what are the equivalent, most fruitful heuristics for guiding judgment? Miracles are almost by definition treated as rare, and formal recognitions today tend to involve an exclusion of natural causes that is arguably always incomplete. So there are a few places and organizations that do formal assessments of miracles, like in Lourdes. And if you read the medical reports, they always say at the end, we can't explain this, but it's always provisional, so that's how the reports are finished. So why shouldn't the principle of no miracles be selected as the heuristic creed of all scientific judgments? Okay, so what we put together is our first of our short videos of the project, and let's see what you think.
Objects of wonder are all around us in the natural world. Many of these works of beauty provoke amazement even when we know what caused them. But are there other objects of wonder, true miracles without natural causes, which may be attributed to special divine action? In early modern science, when the universe was thought of like a machine, a miracle was defined in terms of breaking the laws of nature. The natural world today appears more complex, embracing spontaneity, information, indeterminism, and personal action. In light of these changes, a miracle may be better thought of as an extraordinary event that exceeds the productive power of nature. Are such miracles possible? If so, do miracles happen? Even accounts of Revelation treat such signs and wonders as rare. Indeed, miracles are rare almost by definition, since the extraordinary presupposes the ordinary, just as a river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. Given the success of science in uncovering the regularities of nature, why should we even consider the possibility of miracles? One reason is that these investigations have proved fruitful in the history of ideas. Careful theoretical and practical considerations of the questions about miracles have stimulated the development of philosophy and interest in experimental methods to isolate and identify causes. Questions about miracles are also connected to questions about our own freedom. If a human person is free to interrupt the law-like behavior of a falling stone, then why not a divine agent? If, on the other hand, divine intervention is declared impossible, how does human free will escape the same judgment in a world of impersonal causes, reducing human beings to machines? But there is another reason for examining questions about miracles. Despite its many wonders, the natural world appears to lack resources to make us perfectly and permanently happy, especially given personal death and eventual cosmic death. A starting point that treats miracles as rare, if they happen, but worthy of consideration as possible gifts and signs of hope, may be more prudent than closing the door on the issue altogether.
So I won't say anything else about miracles, but we can discuss that say later. So I want to now look at the issue of providence. Now, as a working definition, providence, coming again from a Latin word to foresee or attend to, conveys the notion of God directing the cosmos and human affairs with wise benevolence. As with many kinds of purported special divine action, competing views tend to be fought out in the arena of narrative or grand narrative. But the case of providence is a bit special because conflicts in the interpretation of purported special divine action actually overlap with at least two other major battlegrounds today. The first is the possibility of end-directed causation in nature, so various varieties of teleology. And second, in theology, the possibility of end-directed causation in the matters of salvation, particularly predestination. And to give you an example of two competing cosmic narratives, I thought I'd put Pope Clement I against Professor Simon Blackburn. So there's Simon Blackburn commenting on a book by John Polkinghorne, and basically telling a story. You know, science teaches us human beings are infinitesimally small. We evolved because of a number of cosmic accidents. Nature shows us no particular favors. We get parasites, diseases, we die. We're not that nice, and that's it. And that's a scientific picture of the world. Okay. And now here's this Clement I letter to the Corinthians. And this is actually one of the first documents we have outside the New Testament. What fascinates me is that you would think they've had other things to think about at this stage. Christians enter the history books, the pagan history books, being burnt alive in Nero's pleasure gardens. And Clement I, traditionally, the story is that he was thrown into the Black Sea tied to an anchor. So you think they've got other things on their minds, right? But they're already thinking about cosmology. It was fascinating. So let us look steadfastly to the Father and Creator of the whole world, the heavens being put in motion by his appointment are subject to him in peace, the sun and the moon and the dances of the stars, according to his appointment in harmony and without any violation of order, roll on the courses appointed to them. And it's all this idea of peace and harmony and law in the heavens. Interesting, isn't it? If you had to start from those two perspectives, which do you think would actually be ultimately more fruitful for science, I wonder? Okay. So, end-directed action. This is where all these issues overlap in a way that's not always distinguished. And this is a schematic. I'm not saying there is overlap. I'm just saying these are the issues. So, philosophy, there's issues of teleology, teleonomy, free will, foresight, and tons of stuff in biology, complexity, psychology, neuroscience. And then there's the issue of providence and predestination, all controversial. Now, as is well known, end-directed action of any kind is scarcely a popular concept in early modern science, and this hostility has modern-day counterparts. I really chose this book for its title, because it just really gets a sense of it. D. Hanke, Teleology, the explanation that bedevils biology. Right? That's just published a few years ago. And as is fairly well known, but despite this, as is fairly well known, directedness and concomitant temporal asymmetry has cautiously been rehabilitated over the past century. An early intimation of this was entropy, a sort of negative direction. But then when people were developing cybernetics, thinking about this early in the 50s, feedback loops in electromechanical systems, and actually a few oddities in my own old field of particle physics. There were at least two systems which seemed to violate time symmetry, and no one's got a clue what that's about. The neutral kaon system and just the neutral d mesons. One of the consequences, interestingly, is we could tell aliens in another galaxy what antimatter is without ambiguity. So if you wanted to shake hands with them, you could just check before you blew one another up. Okay. So teleology and strange attractors. What is not as well known as it should be is that end-directedness is actually fairly ubiquitous in remarkably simple systems. Now, part of the reason for this fact part of the reason for that the fact has been opaque to us for centuries is that physics filters out observations, or filters observations through the lens of the tiny subset of systems we can integrate, the phenomenological quantitative behavior of two-body systems. And that, by the way, explains what we can and cannot do in physics, more or less. So we can do solar system physics really, really well. We can do atomic physics pretty well. We can't do nuclear physics that well, and we can't do quark physics in protons really well at all. Because it's just so much complexity, we can't unpick it in the way that the tools, that we can bring our tools to bear. We just number crunch through supercomputers, and we still can't quite get it. Okay, so my contention, shared by some others, is that the metaphysics of greater than two-body systems is different in kind, not in degree. And this has, by the way, shaped the background of so much of our philosophy, and in turn so much of our theology for centuries. Many final states, termed strange attractors, are irreducible even in principle to initial states. Now, when these things were discovered, they were called chaotic systems. I call them Aristotelian engines. They break down initial information and transform what is left into final forms. And you actually need something which is a non-formal principle of continuity, which you can call matter. So you actually get a restoration of the four-cause system, or three-cause system in this case, in chaotic systems. So what Aristotle obviously inspired him, he invented biology and cut up a lot of living things. Was really fascinated by the fact that all the matter is organized towards the flourishing of the thing. And this really shapes his way of looking at the world. And of course, today we're much more mechanistic. But the point, and that's a classical mechanical system, the pendulum. But the thing is, since the 1960s, we've been able to actually simulate, through brute force, all these systems which actually don't behave like this. And the difference here is a pendulum will work its way down to the bottom state through energy dissipation. But these don't. There's no energy dissipation. And in the phase space of the system, you move towards a final form. It took me a long time to realize the way we look at these systems is completely wrong. So traditionally, what people worry about is the trajectory of a point. But if you think of them in terms of a shape, not a point, a shape demarcated by points, and the shape carries initial information. As you follow each point in your mind's eye through the system, and all that shape is broken down, and a new shape forms, which is irreducible to the initial shape. It's not formally connected. It's quite amazing. And then, of course, people started to think, well, maybe this is what's happening in nature, all kinds of self-organization, the red spot as seen on Jupiter by Voyager 2, for example. Now, I agree very strongly with those who are wary about making any direct connection between these developments and providence. And this is a warning by Ernst Mayr. The acknowledgement of end-directed phenomenon, we'll let it back in a bit, does not have to imply the endorsement of unverifiable theological or metaphysical claims, a rejection of physico-chemical explanations or anthropomorphism. Fine, okay. At the same time, what these developments do represent, I think, is a challenge to the dominant root metaphor of our time, of our centuries. And root metaphor I'm taking as a phrase from Michael Ruse. So instead of the mechanistic metaphor encroaching on the organic, which is what's been going on the last few centuries, that's why you hear people talk about meat machines as to describe animals and human beings. It seems that the organic metaphor extends surprisingly far into the mechanistic. So the pattern of snowflakes and flowers have something in common. Now, in terms of providence generally, I'm not sure of the implications. I'm not sure what implications to draw from this at all, except that they incline us, the imagination, towards gardener rather than the watchmaker metaphors. But in regard to the vexed issue of predestination, which has bedeviled a lot of debate the last few centuries, this change of perspective might have some helpful implications. Theologians have struggled to make sense of predestination, but especially since the rise of the root metaphor of the machine. Now, if, however, predestination refers more to an organizing principle of the life of grace, we'll talk about that later, towards fruition, but without predestination being treated like a prediction, then perhaps that makes more sense. So it gives us more room to think about this issue. And the verse, I think of in Scripture, Romans 8:28, all things work to the good for those who love God. So the idea of, let me show you, let's go back to this picture. So the point is, while the plant is alive, all the matter is organized towards its final form. You might say predestined towards its final form. But that doesn't mean predict that the plant will succeed in flowering, because it will always be cut down. So you actually have an organic metaphor for predestination. There was a hint of this in Aquinas' commentary on the Gospel of John in relation to Judas, because there's a funny phrase. He says, what happened to Judas? Well, he was predestined and then he lost it. Huh? So how does that work? Well, maybe you think about it organically, then you get this sense of growth and then being cut off. In other words, you have to cultivate saints. You don't manufacture them. Okay. I thought I'd put a picture of a saint there, trays of Lisieux associated with flowers. Okay. Right, so that's what I want to say about providence. I want to talk mainly about grace here. Now, this word is all over the New Testament, also a big word in Judaism. This is a famous phrase, near the introduction of John's Gospel. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, unlike all modes of purported special divine action, the word grace has an everyday sense, even a non-religious sense, albeit one that carries overtones of gift, even a sense of gentle divine gift. And there are some rare examples of the word in classical philosophy, quite a bit in the Eudemian ethics, for example. St. Paul refers to grace 101 times, I'm told. Some instances might be read in an everyday sense, but in many places, some special principle and gift related to divine action seems to be indicated. So this is how he concludes his second letter to the Corinthians: the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. It's a way that Catholic liturgy introduces the Mass, so it's liturgically rather an important verse. Grace is not therefore some scholastic term, and by implication for some people superfluous and artificial. One needs to work hard to deny its implications in the New Testament. But the term is undoubtedly also at the heart of an extraordinary range of historical and present-day controversies. In my judgment, it's the foremost issue in theology, and indeed a key reason for the fragmentation of theology today. So as we've lost a sense of what grace is, theology is fragmenting. In this section, I want to review briefly research I've done over the past decade to elucidate an understanding of grace, and it links to developments in psychology. So it's another example of bringing a scientific perspective to bear on the question of special divine action. Now, the term grace has suffered from false friends, in the sense that overextension of the term, particularly in Baroque scholasticism, tends to obscure the key idea. So people overuse the word. You sometimes read phrases like the grace of final perseverance, for example. And it's a bit like Aristotle's critique of what people did to Plato's notion of substance, that they overused it. So the key idea is that the central focus or organizing principle of the use of grace is that of a transfigured and new life. And by the way, if you think this is Catholicism, you may have heard of being born again. Okay, this is a phrase all over American evangelicalism. Right? I mean, anyone steeply versed in Scripture comes up with this stuff in all kinds of different ways. So the key issue of grace pertains to a distinction that runs through the entirety of sacred Scriptures, particularly Judaism and Christianity. Examples of the distinction, the covenant and setting apart of the Jewish people. I chose 1 Samuel 8:4 to illustrate this. This is when the people ask for a king because they want to be just like everyone else. And Samuel says, no, you don't want a king. Kings are bad news. But they just want to be like everyone else, right? They get a bit tired of being set apart. But that's their job. And then there are also distinct life words in the New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John. The word Zoe as life for John in the Gospel of John is only used in relation to the Father, Son, and Spirit, and a sharing of the life of God. Many parables of Jesus, like the seed sown in the ground, also illustrate this dynamic where you get something added to nature. Now, all this was developed in the High Middle Ages and became mainstream in theology in the 13th century. The term supernatural is used over 200 times by Aquinas. Interesting, this is how it started. It's all those popular television programs referring to the supernatural today all started in the 13th century. And it's actually a Nietzschean parody of the term. And all this was designed to demarcate the supernatural life of grace from the life of nature. Now, natural and supernatural, in fact, developed symbiotically as contrast terms, but with different boundaries from those found today. So, in philosophical literature today, supernatural means God stuff and God's action stuff. That's not how it meant in the 13th century. So God stuff was included within nature as first cause, but in a certain kind of relation to God, it was described as supernatural. And this is a relic of this at the end of the Catholic baptism liturgy. So after baptizing the child, then the invitation is, let us join and pray the Christian prayer, Our Father, right? As you don't do that until after the baptism. Now, within much of Christianity in the 20th century, the relationship between the natural nature and supernatural, the life of grace, has been the focus of titanic, but mostly behind-the-scenes battles. It's like the Somme. Now, although the terminology might seem arcane, the effects have reached into every part of Christian life, because they touch on the key issue, the distinctiveness of the Christian vocation and life. I'll just give you an old magisterial definition from 1870. This is the point where it's sort of given the most official kind of, you see this dynamic most officially emphasized. And of course, what's happening in the 19th century is the rise of rationalism and naturalism. And so there's this defense of the importance of the supernatural in society as well. And basically, it's pretty hard-hitting. It said, look, if you abandon the supernatural, you're going to lose the natural as well. You're going to actually end up in the abyss of pantheism, materialism, and atheism, destroying rational nature, destroying the criteria of what is right and just, destroying the foundations of human society. Okay, we'll see that later. Right, so grace, mid-20th century collapse. So up to the 1950s, Baroque neo-scholasticism was still formally defending the natural-supernatural distinction, but it basically imploded over the next 20 years, and that's basically the situation today. Now, it's very easy to identify the key players involved in triggering this implosion. It took me many years to realize that the source goes back into neo-scholasticism. The issue is not really the formal definitions, it's the metaphors. How people imagined the life of grace, how they taught it to their students, the images that passed into popular piety. And up to the 1950s, all the textbooks, you see the metaphors being used are metaphors of elevation. The supernatural is described as a higher version of the natural life, which turns a difference of kind into a difference of degree. And this was parodied, correctly by its critics, as two-tier flourishing. I'll give you lots of examples of that if you're interested. Now, so we've got this implosion, a lot of identity crisis among Christians and in theology about what it's all about, and it goes back to this issue of grace. Now, what I've been concerned to address over the last 15 years is how to relate the life of nature and life of grace, and thanks particularly to prompting by Professor Eleanor Stump, I took a radically new approach, but with the retrospective parallels in spiritual and devotional writings. And the precursors of setting this up was to grasp that there's been at least one very detailed and very mysterious analytic description of the supernatural life. And most students who learn anything about Aquinas will learn about the 5 proofs for the existence of God. That's how he's taught at undergraduate level philosophy. I always point out there's one article. He wrote 1,006 articles on the virtues, which almost no one ever reads. But it's like this huge map, and it's almost screaming out, saying this is what this supernatural life is meant to be like. And then the second thing to grasp is that Aquinas' description is nothing like human nature as described in Nicomachean Ethics. This fact passes a lot of scholars by. I reviewed a book called Aquinas and Nicomachean Ethics for the Notre Dame Philosophical Review a few months ago, and they were all avoiding this issue. Now, the difference is of a kind, not of degree. So finding a root metaphor for what's described in this map may provide a possible way for understanding the whole problem of relating grace, this all-important form of special divine action, to nature. So I spent a long time working through spreadsheets and Excel stuff and hundreds of connections and so on, thinking out, what is he doing? What is he doing? Don't just focus on a couple of articles, see the structure. And there's a lot of stuff that embarrasses philosophers, so I'll just bring it to your attention. Because he doesn't just talk about virtues, he doesn't have a virtue ethics, he talks about virtue, gift, beatitude, and fruit ethics. But because we focus things through Aristotelian lens, we cut that stuff out. It's like Douglas Adams in his book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, invents a somebody else's problem field. Where if you put this field over somebody, you can't see it anymore. And it's like a lot of Aquinas' work has a somebody else's problem field erected over it, so people just ignore it. And the way it's integrated, you see a virtue connected to a gift of the Holy Spirit, and then there's 2 actualizations, a beatitude and a fruit. He says they form a connection, an organic kind of connection. And some of you may have seen this before, but I'll just review it quickly. The way it differs is like this. So if you have virtues and an object, and the whole point of high classical philosophy with regard to the good life was to develop the virtues with respect to objects. Now, the gifts are a bit different. The gifts infuse virtues, he sets his problem up differently. So in relation to God, we're moved by God with respect to some object. That's how he sets us up. And it took a while to figure out a metaphor for this movement, but basically it's all around us. So if you look at children, they start pointing, and this is the way that they unlock the world. They communicate with others, they draw objects to others' attention. They begin to interact this way. A lot of language gets started this way. A lot of character gets started this way. And this beautiful field of joint attention, which Peter Hobson defines as a shared awareness of the sharing of focus, sharing an attitude towards the event or thing in question. And basically, I think this is the root metaphor. And we also know what's put this work on an empirical basis is that there's some people who don't have it, or at least have it in an atypical way. So a classic of the study of autism has been this book called The Siege by Clara Claiborne Park. But the key point early on is the mother had never seen the daughter point. And that's when she began to think hard about what was happening and what she should be encouraging her child to do. So my conclusion of this part of the work, so the root metaphor of the life of grace can be thought of as joint attention with God, but experimental psychology also strongly implies that joint attention and second-person relatedness are correlated. By second-person relatedness, I mean the sort of thing that Buber was talking about, the sort of thing that Levinas talks about. I say they're actually synonymous. Now, psychology has also studied many cases in which joint attention is atypical or practically absent. The most well-known example is autistic spectrum disorder. So another way of thinking about grace is that it's a life that dispels the innate and near universal spiritual autism of the life of nature. So that's the connection between nature and grace, I'd suggest. This connection is metaphorical, just as blindness has often been used as a metaphor of a spiritual state. But it's one that has proved very fruitful in interpreting Aquinas and giving a new perspective on human flourishing. So here's an example of how it works out in practice. There's Aristotle talking about God. A lot of students are quite surprised to know he talks quite a lot about God, but it's right there. Metaphysics, Book 12, the summit of his summit work. We say, therefore, God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life, duration, continuous, and eternal belong to God, for this is God. And then Augustine, several centuries later, late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and new, late have I loved you. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I've burned for your peace. I mean, even the grammar suggests that something has changed. And this is going to set civilization on a different path. I think there are lots of goodies to be drawn from this interpretation, and I look forward to the next few years in unpacking them. I think it helps to resolve the Pelagian zero-sum game, which we've been engaged with for the last few centuries, of working out whether it's God's cause or my cause. Well, how about neither? This is an example from a researcher who does a lot of work with mother-child interactions, particularly, and the idea of never one person causing the other, but this mutual activity. I think also it gives us a handle on what Aquinas calls the fruits of the Holy Spirit. I would say they're the root of what we call emotions. Emotions have normally been linked to passions in scholastic philosophy. I don't think that's quite right. I think they're closer linked to what is called fruits. And fruits I interpret in terms of resonance. That's a term I got from physics. Resonances are all over physics. But I think people can resonate. I think if you can get a certain sense where you get players in an orchestra and they're all in perfect time, then suddenly the music is flying along. And friendship is like that. And I think also it has all kinds of goodies for good old secular virtue ethics, which adds all kinds of stuff we kind of missed. So here's a fun one. If you stick a pair of eyes on an honesty box, people are more honest. Just a pair of eyes, nothing else. I have several nieces. I'm very fascinated by how they learn temperance. And it's not the way Aristotle taught us. It's normally through games. So they're not interested in the food, but they are very interested in the relationship or the other person's food. And of course, if you want to lose virtue temporarily, as in the Viennese carnival, you might stick a mask on. Okay, I'll leave grace and move on to inspiration. To inspire means figuratively to infuse some thought or feeling into a person as if by breathing, to influence or actuate by special divine or supernatural agency, definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. Besides breath, another common metaphor is a voice. And I'm quite surprised to learn Socrates talks about this. Thanks, I didn't know that. It came from the article in Divine Illumination in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And he describes hearing a voice starting back in his childhood. In addition, the notion of illumination, vaguely or explicitly associated with the divine, is surprisingly common in Greek, especially Platonic philosophy, like the form of the sun, and was developed into a theory of knowledge by Augustine. Now, as a general theory of knowledge, this was rejected in the High Middle Ages by Aristotelianism and by Scotus. Scotus was I heard him described as only he could do it, because it's like Nixon going to China, because he was actually in the Franciscan tradition. But he attacked this notion of divine illumination as a general theory of knowledge. But special divine inspiration remained. The topic, its terminology and history are very complex, but in broad terms, inspiration seems to have fallen into two types. One being pointillistic, do this, don't do that. And that's this voice metaphor, prophets, Socrates, perhaps. But most cognitive inspiration, however, seems to be of a big picture or seeing as variety, associated with metaphors of light and illumination. And in the remainder of this presentation, I focus on illuminative inspiration. And there's a beautiful description of this in a parable by C.S. Lewis, a conversion story. What awaited, this is a woman who has this conversion experience. What awaited her there was serious to the degree of sorrow and beyond. There was no form nor sound. The mould under the bushes, the moss on the path, and a little brick border were not visibly changed. But they were changed. A boundary had been crossed. She had come into a world, or into a person, or into the presence of a person. Something expectant, patient, inexorable met her with no veil or protection between. Now, the kind of experience Lewis describes here is probably more common and arguably more efficacious by the measure of changed lives than purported miracles. Like a light switch being thrown, a door into daylight opening into a dark room, or someone who's blind receiving sight, there's a step change, a shift to a different or higher perspective. Such insights have many non-religious or non-religiously ascribed counterparts, including pivotal scientific breakthroughs, Archimedes' Eureka moment, the Ouroboros dream of August Kerkel, who discovered benzene, and arguably all the really revolutionary breakthroughs in the science involve insight. But everyday understanding may in fact lie along the same spectrum. So here are another set of controversial overlapping fields that tend to need attention. So you've got understanding in philosophy, you've got Gestalt perception, psychology, maybe illuminative inspiration, special divine action. It's a schematic. I'm not saying they do overlap, but these are the sorts of issues. Some people think, and I'm sympathetic to this, that you can actually identify an asymmetry in brain operation. It's interesting, if you don't have the right brain operating, you seem to lose the big picture stuff. In most people. Okay, so the problem of insight. Insight has a sudden all-at-once quality. It's not the conclusion of an argument, so standard philosophical analysis can't get a purchase, which is why philosophers tend not to write about it. I said to someone in Notre Dame a few days ago, I was interested in insight, and they said, you're studying Lonergan. Well, no, but he's the only one who's written a big book on this subject. Instead, insight involves a presentation or representation of what is known from a new perspective or in a new light. And a common visual example of this change of perspective is the illusion made famous by Ludwig Wittgenstein, in which one and the same unchanging image, seen initially to be a duck, is suddenly seen as a rabbit or vice versa. Simply seeing an object as an object is an everyday example, which we often fail to notice until a change or inconsistency comes to our attention. Oh, by the way, if you check the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, you will not find any article on understanding. You will not find any article on insight. I've got to torch them. Okay, so there's an example of an Escher diagram, and you see you can't get a purchase on it all at once. You keep shifting your understanding of what you're seeing. And this is an example of suddenly noticing what we take for granted in ordinary cognition. Interestingly, we've put this facility to work in the most successful crowdsourced science research of recent years, which is Galaxy Zoo. And anyone can play this game. So you can log into Galaxy Zoo and help explore a galaxy. And the computer will present to you a galaxy perhaps no human eye has ever looked at before. And you'll be asked to judge whether it's a spiral galaxy or a spherical galaxy or a funny disordered galaxy or something that someone else ought to have another look at. And the reason why we ask people to do this is that computers it's very hard to get a computer to do this, to program. This is a judgment of understanding, which AI just can't get a handle on, or not very easily. Or to give another example, let's take the old Hubble's law. We see a straight line. That's a very mysterious process, But we make that judgment as seeing as. You can program a computer to find the best fit, but you've already made the judgment of what is meant to be there. Okay. So the impossibility of analyzing insight directly or generating insights at will. So insight's not the conclusion of an argument. It can sometimes disrupt previously consistent worldviews. I think that's what happened to Galileo. He just looked at the telescope and saw, and the arguments came later, right? Now, insights have a sudden all-at-once quality. There's no discrete steps or parts susceptible to direct analysis, so we'd have to study it indirectly. But we can create favorable conditions, and many of these conditions involve social interaction with other persons with different insights. And a lovely quotation from Jane Austen, Mansfield Park. I'm grateful for my mother for finding this, but it describes Edmund teaching this woman, Fanny, literature, and he's correcting her judgment, and it's a story of its interpersonal interaction by which her insights are accelerated. And she describes the way that she loves him for doing this. And this all ties into epistemic humility and pride. I won't get into this now, but the 4 species of pride. And you can actually find pride inhibits understanding, not logic. And you actually need, you see, understanding is more like a gift. It's not something you can resolve at the end of an argument. And you almost have to sort of let go internally or in union with someone else. So I came up recently with a definition of epistemic humility. It's a bit complicated, but I'm trying to refine it. A disposition to hold back from attempts to gain the goals of complete understanding inordinately, namely my manipulation of pre-existing representations that are closed to new presentations of the world. And but a quick way of seeing this is Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen. And this really sums up this whole insight issue. And I've worried about this for 40 years. And suddenly, a few months ago, I realized what he was talking about. So the little boy has caught evil splinters in his eye. He can no longer see beauty. He can only see, but he does know his multiplication tables, his fractions, and the square miles of every country in Europe and its population. And he's got this mastery of rationalistic knowledge. And as he's making this boast, the Snow Queen carries him away to her palace, at the center of which is a frozen lake, which the Snow Queen describes as the mirror of reason. There he is. And he's left on this frozen lake, trying to fit flat pieces of ice together to solve a puzzle. And he can't solve the puzzle. And he thinks it's very beautiful, but he's just focused on this puzzle. And he can't get out the palace until he's solved this, found the answer. And in fact, it's the little girl who has to come and rescue him. And after some adventures, she comes through the palace, and she actually it's her tears, and they melt his heart. And then suddenly he can see things clearly, and eventually is able to walk out the palace. And I think it's this example of epistemic humility. And suddenly, the letters that he's told to find solve themselves, and he can see the picture. Now, just 2 brief conclusions with this. So, this is actually an article quoting from someone at MIT. So, it's a book called Social Physics. I think our universes are becoming like Henry Ford factories. I mean, we're churning stuff out, right? But somehow the insights, they're not as many as in some fields as would have happened 50, 60 years ago. And so how do we get over this? Now, one practical way is, well, just to get out more, mix with colleagues in different fields and listen respectfully to those with different perspectives and expertise. So this man was quoted at MIT as just taking a walk now and again and talking to people in different fields. They don't have to be the best people in those fields, but he just gets a different perspective on the world. That's how he got inspirations. And amid the deadly earnestness of the modern academy, I think there's a great need to rediscover the virtue of intellectual play, especially in dialogue with others, to break the ice of frozen representations that form quickly over cognition of the world. But I thought the same thing applies to divine action. So a theological perspective implies the following counterintuitive course of action. If there's a God who desires to communicate understanding with us, then such insights are going to arise principally in the context of practices that foster an I-you relationship with God. Such practices may include divinely revealed narratives of special divine action, liturgies, sacred art, and perhaps by harmonizational and subliminal level, sacred music. So put it on the headphones, listen to some Gregorian chant, and you might just get some inspiration, right? I actually remember saying this in a business seminar about 15 years ago, and suddenly it actually became quite fashionable for a while. Okay, and prayer, a second personal prayer. Well, it's worth a shot. Okay, so a few concluding remarks. Just sum it up in a few words. Miracles, what can science give on these things? So this is the state so far with the thinking. Very, very, very compact. Miracles, well, clarification. I think just we can bring we help to clarify the issue. With providence, that gives us organic metaphors. With grace, I think we get second-person relatedness. And with inspiration, I think we need to look at social insight. And then I want to just conclude by showing you a few of my favorite pictures, showing you what I think, how theology returns the favor. And you might say, well, science doesn't exclude theology, whatever. Okay, but what does theology do for science? It doesn't give us facts, it doesn't give us formulae, whatever. It does, but it does paint a picture. And you can see this in art. So this is one my favorite painting, actually, 1432. The Van Eyck Mystic Lamb, and it's the most symbolically perfect, the most theologically perfect symbolic picture of heaven that art has ever come up with. And actually you can see all kinds of special divine action implied, inspiration, miracle, and grace and providence. Now watch what happens. In 1524, we start reducing the special divine action bits. So the saints get smaller, the landscape gets bigger. You can see the focus shifting in European art. By 1569, the church is in the corner and the focus is on nature. And by 1821, this high point of English landscape painting, Constable's The Hay Wain. Okay, what happens next? Let me show you. Van Gogh's, here's the last picture before he committed suicide. The road isn't going anywhere and the vertical dimension is collapsing, but look, we're losing clarity. And then by 1947, Jackson Pollock's Enchanted Forest. I'm not making a value judgment, I'm just saying that the culture has affected the way we look at the world. And art, I think, is giving us a kind of early warning of this. We had another warning in London in 2011. Okay, so it's just approaching 10 o'clock. I'm sure there are plenty of questions throughout the day. Sorry, I had to be quite thorough that presentation, and not time for questions now, but do collar me in the coffee break, and just finish going back at that picture, the ultimate fruits of special divine action, and one of my favorite quotes, "Beloved, we are God's children. It does not now, we're God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we shall know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." 10 o'clock, thank you very much.